Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to part two of my review for Last Night in Soho, Edgar Wright's 2021 supernatural psychedelic horror film. And I wanted to start out with doing a little bit of a recap. I had left off last time talking about Eloise when she woke up after her first dream, slash um, trip, astral trip through the mirror portal into a timeline from the past, that being the year 1965. So now we're going to start off with what happens after she meets Eloise and Jack. And I wanted to go back actually to what I was talking about in my first video where I was comparing the film to Phantom of the Paradise, Brian De Palma's 1974 rock opera or glam rock opera classic. So I developed a theory here based on what has been happening up to this point. So essentially, Jack is Paul Williams' character, Swan, and William Finley's dual character of Winslow Leach and the Phantom can be seen in the split characters of Sandy and Eloise. And this theory that I'm describing here, this thesis, this manifesto I'm making, is going to foreshadow what's going to happen later on in the film. But I highly recommend watching Phantom of the Paradise because you will see parallels between these two movies. So the way I see it is that the mirror in Last Night in Soho, being a portal that links both the lives of Eloise and Sandy between the past and the present, is like an alternate storyline of how Winslow becomes the Phantom. And in Sandy's case, she embodies both. Whereas, like, Eloise is this proxy, this confidant who develops a very empathic relationship with Sandy, to the point where it feels like they are essentially one person, and she wants to accompany Sandy every way that she can and help her in her journey to unravel her potential, which also means, having to thwart off enemies along the way in the process. But now, at first, things start out pretty innocent. Eloise starts going through a sexual awakening, imitating lines that Sandy said in the past, such as when, for example, Eloise bumps into that black kid, John, who she met very early on in the film after getting out of the taxi and going into the clerk store to buy herself a Coca-Cola. Um, so, so John is this character who is basically the one quiet zone amidst, the insane London pandemonium youth that Eloise encounters when she first moves to her college dorm. John is essentially the one guy who treats Eloise with respect. Um, like, and in fact, it's during the party scene when the two bump into each other again. John is actually telling this one guy off who's harassing Eloise for her tastes in 60s music, calling it granny stuff. Um, so when John tells that guy to go screw himself, she he's also um, telling Eloise, don't mind him. He's not as bad as you think he is. Doing everything that he can to make her feel comfortable, during her stay in London. And he accidentally drinks Eloise's Coca-Cola that was in the fridge that had her name clearly marked on it. That's what Eloise actually had to do, considering if you saw in the one still from part one, Jocasta is a whore for taking up space in the refrigerator, marking everything with her name on it. So it's like Eloise only had this one little space where she could put her Coca-Cola, and poor Eloise had that space violated by this black kid, who the next day he makes up for it by purchasing another can of Coca-Cola for Eloise. And when Ellie takes the Coke that John had bought for her to make up for it, the one that he drank at Jocasta's party, he says, "It's the least I can do," in which Ellie responds, "What's the most?" Now that exchange right there is a reflection on the same seductive gesture that Jack offers. The scene when Jack offers to give Sandy a ride home after leaving the club. And, so again, the same thing happens where what happened prior to that, and this was after Jack had offered a dance to Sandy, was, you know, this old creepy pervert guy who had been hitting on Sandy from the instant that she walked in, confronts Sandy again, and an incident of tension starts building up, which leads to Jack punching the guy's lights out for sexually harassing Sandy. This excites Sandy so much that that's what leads to the two making out inside the phone booth. And then following that, Jack ends up giving Sandy a ride home, to which he also says, it's the least I can do. And then Sandy says, "What's the most?" So again, this parallel timeline universe starts out as very, very cute and very playful. And Ellie's dreams that follow after this involve a sequence in which Jack takes Sandy out to this club that he knows to have her audition for a couple of his mates in management. And the song that she auditions for is Downtown by Petula Clark, which is actually a beautiful rendition, albeit a lot more chill, laid back, even has an ambient, slight down-tempo electronic flavor to it. It's very, very different from the Petula Clark song from the 60s, which is way more energetic and gets your adrenaline pumping when you listen to it. So that's a beautiful scene. And things really start seeming to look up for Sandy at this point. I mean, like the two constantly exchange romantic gestures back and forth. I mean, there's a makeout scene, which is where we first now get a glimpse of the point of common origin here. This is where we see Sandy now inside the same apartment that Ellie is living in 2021. The same apartment that where Jack and Sandy go to make out and have sex, basically. So, so yeah, everything is great. Um, Meanwhile, Eloise in the present day is undergoing, of course, her own transformation, um, dressing dressing up more to look the part of the 60s. She ends up impressing even her landlady, Alexandra, who um, starts, having a bit more of a softer spot for Eloise at this point because of the fact that Eloise is so hung up on how the 1960s were so much better in terms of music, in terms of fashion, in terms of culture. This is one of those parts where I have to laugh, and it's kind of it's kind of a malicious laugh because of the fact that you know even before stepping into this movie, I knew that like the 1960s had a very Twilight atmosphere to it. Like it was half light and half dark, the whole mood of the 60s. You know, like it gets, so much so that it really irritates me when people say, "Oh, the 1960s was the best decade ever, and music after that point sucked." It's like, go fuck yourself. you know, why don't you just build a time machine and go back and live in that time period and shut up with your stupid existential angst about living in the present day, yeah? Because you know what? You got to start living in the moment. And, you know, the, everybody just wants to focus on the peace and the love and the glamour aspects of it. I mean, even Eloise, when she ends up having to get a job at the bar, because she needs to make more money to pay for all these expensive dresses and coats. The manager over there the manager at the bar talks all about how she remembers only the laughs and the cheers and the good times of the 1960s working at that bar, and how just the whole positive energy of that time seeps into the wall. However, things eventually do take a strange and dark turn. At first, there's the little clues here and there. Outside of the boutique shop where Eloise buys the coat, she sees the name of the club, which is where Sandy was taken by Jack to perform downtown. And the thing is that Eloise had never been to those places before, but she obviously starts seeing a synchronistic event going on in which she feels like she's visited those places before, though it was her dream body, where she was living her personified life as Sandy, that makes Eloise think that she had been there before. What I mean to say is that, like, like this isn't just a dream. What she experiences in the 1960s is definitely not a dream. This, this is all very, very real to her, and she's seen, the effects of these past locations now making an impact on her in the present day. Um, but that's not even the worst of it. I mean, it's more just like an element of curiosity, yeah, that happens. Where things really start to get dark is in another dream where Eloise is watching a burlesque singer performing this puppeteer style dance. And Ellie was expecting that this performer was supposed to be Sandy. Now, there's a whole team of go go dancers in the background accompanying this main singer. And as Eloise is looking around, eyeing the backup dancers, she notices one of them to be Sandy. And indeed, um, when the camera really zooms in on Sandy, you can see that she's really unsatisfied with what she's clearly being forced to do. She's clearly been sidelined, um, stripped of her talent, and basically placed down on the second tier of the ladder. Instead of being a singer, which is what her core talent is, she's forced now to become a backup dancer. Because apparently Jack doesn't really see her as a singer. He sees her more as a sex object, as a starlet. And it's kind of unclear at this point if this is how Sandy actually started out, because there are clues later on that lead to the fact that Ellie was in fact, that Sandy was in fact a whore before she entered into Jack's life. But she wanted to kind of push that more into the background. It's hard to know, like, what hidden details of Sandy's life are not being shown here. You just have to speculate. And I kind of get the sense that it's also tied to Ellie's dead mother. Because of course that's the question that has actually been popping up in my mind, you know, especially at the end of this movie. And I know I'm jumping around a bit, but it's a question that I feel also goes right back to the beginning. Where the beginning of the beginning of when Ellie first meets Sandy. Is Sandy Ellie's mom? Like, are they the same? Are they the same woman? Again, it's hard to tell. All I do know, though, at this point is that Jack's true identity is exposed. He's not a manager. He's not an owner of a club. He's a pimp. And he takes advantage of Sandy by downplaying her real talents and reducing her to just a backup dancer. Everybody's got to start somewhere, he says, as his excuse every time Sandy whines and complains. Well, and this is also just reinforcing that that's exactly what Sandy herself says, that everyone's got to start somewhere. I wanted to zoom in. I wanted to zoom out here for a second to focus on Diana Rigg, her character as the landlady. What I was saying a little bit earlier about the whole spell of people fantasizing the 1960s as being the best decade in music and culture and all that blah blah blah. Diana Rigg actually has gone on record when she was interviewed um, during the making of this movie. She herself had admitted that she actually never had any good memories of the 1960s. The 1960s just flew by fast for her. The 1960s was a time where she was just working. She was focused on the TV show The Avengers, a show that I happened to watch when I was a kid. She plays Mrs. Peel, and Patrick McGowan, I think, is Mr. Steele, or Mr. Steed. It was a really, really fun and campy detective series that I watched as a kid. And that was basically Diana Rigg's life in the 60s. So she never got into the whole flower power thing whatsoever, or hanging out with hippies and smoking ganja, or getting involved with nudist colonies and running around naked in in the river. None of that stuff. None of that stuff at all was going on. Yeah, so that's exactly the reason why I had to laugh with bitter sarcasm, because the scene where Ellie returns home after getting her hair dyed blonde, and Alex, the landlady, at first not recognizing her. That's when Ellie turns around to look at Alex, and the moment of nostalgia causes her face to lighten up. She asks Ellie, "I hear you playing that old music upstairs. Aren't you a little young to be listening to that stuff?" And of course, Ellie just confidently says, "Oh, I like the old stuff better. Always did." And, Alex responds, "Yeah, music was so much better then. That's where I have to roll my eyes because I cannot at all take that dialogue seriously. Simply because, I myself used to be that naive as a kid. And honestly, when I look at how all these cocky, condescending, and unhappy baby boomers were, despite how happy and loving the music of that generation was, it just makes me realize how foolish it is today to stand up for that decade. Especially considering how celebrities were being taken advantage of behind the scenes. Oh, the 60s was all about peace and love. Yeah, and you also had evil managers like Jack that were using celebrities like Elvis Presley, for example, to be puppets for the sharks higher up. And even when even family structures were built on a lie in that way, with kids being raised to be obedient to their parents and to not ask questions, even though they treat them badly. Now, okay, honestly, I was being really, really bitter there for a second. As an enthusiast for musical aesthetics, there's a flip side to all this fascination with the 1960s. And even the 1970s and 1980s, which have also been making a revival in the last decade through the 2010s. So there's this concept called hauntology, which is a term that was applied to music since the early 2000s. It's a fringe movement, basically. Wikipedia describes it as a musical genre or a loosely defined stylistic feature that evokes cultural memory and aesthetics of the past. This happened to start with Ariel Pink, who I happen to be a fan of, and his 2000 breakthrough album, The Doldrums. And even before I discovered Ariel Pink, there was, the 2010s, which is where the permutation of hauntology emerged in the form of the genres chillwave and hypnagogic pop, with artists like Neon Indian, Tycho, and Washed Out, artists that brought more of like that trip hoppy sort of vibe, to still keep it somewhat contemporary, but also, bringing in like elements of psychedelic and 80s synth pop and even 70s krautrock electronic elements. It's a very, very beautiful genre, honestly. Well, I mean, these particular genres, chillwave and hypnagogic pop, were all just really, really beautiful genres containing lush, summery, dreamy music that just, like this movie Last Night in Soho, this whole film feels like, one whole trip to the past and back again. Interestingly enough, hauntology has been identified with British culture. Last Night in Soho was filmed in the UK, after all. And it's interesting because this stylistic niche in popular music, called a nostalgia for a future that never came to pass, with a vision of a strange alternate Britain constituted from the reordered refuge of the post-war period. Another way of putting it is it's a lost utopianism, according to music journalist Simon Reynolds, who is famous for writing a book that I actually do need to pick up on sometime, called Retromania: Pop Culture's Addiction to Its Own Past. So having now gone into depth with Diana Rigg's character, I wanted now to switch over and talk about another famous 60s icon that's in this film, and that's Terence Stamp. Terence plays a retired cop named Lindsay, and his role in the film is rather strange, enigmatic. He seems like another stalker at first. He speaks very little, and when he does, he sounds pretty cynical. Like, there's things he knows about a person that he's obviously seen 1,000 times before. And when he first appears, which is fairly after, soon after Ellie gets into London, he's seen coming out of what appears like a strip club, and he notices Ellie at first, but he doesn't really respond. Later, then, when Ellie goes through her transformation, her retro transformation, to look like Sandy, dyeing her hair blonde and buying these really expensive boutique clothes, Lindsay thinks that he's seen a ghost, or at least a copycat. There's even a scene where Lindsay starts following Ellie around and starts saying things like, "I know you from somewhere," which, of course, starts to creep Ellie out, of course. He gives off the appearance of someone who wants to stalk her, and this ties into the clairvoyant visions that Ellie has later on, once she starts to speculate that Lindsay may be Jack. So Terence Stamp certainly seems to be drawing inspiration from General Zod, from Superman 1 and 2. I definitely got that vibe when I was watching him in this role. Now, a little bit about my experience watching Terence Stamp over the years. I've seen him semi regularly throughout the decades, from his obvious megastar roles in the first two Christopher Reeve era Superman films, which of course I saw when I was a kid. And we're talking about like almost 3 decades ago, too. And then later on in '99, he starred in Star Wars The Phantom Menace as Supreme Chancellor Valorum. In fact, I had just watched him in another movie pretty recently, called Wanted from 2008. And I actually remembered him being pretty good in that one. I mainly watched that film because I had just gotten back from Chicago after seeing a show down there, and much of that film was actually shot in Chicago. But yeah, Terrence Stamp was really good in that one too. Um, but then last year, in February 2022, I purchased a book about Federico Fellini's work in the 1960s, which was a golden decade for him. Now, for those of you who don't know Federico Fellini, he is an Italian director whose career goes way back to the 50s, and I think even a little earlier than that, into the 1940s. I can't remember exactly, but I do know that the 1950s was when he started, and he started getting his breakthrough into the mainstream with La Dolce Vita in, I believe, '62. My two most personal favorite films of his are Eight and a Half and Amarcord. And if you haven't seen either of those films, you definitely have seen at least a lot of references to Eight and a Half. If you're a fan of the band REM, clips from that movie were used in the music video to Everybody Hurts. And I know that there have been other references all over the place from Fellini. I mean, as a matter of fact, I had reviewed on this channel Wicker Park, and I know Josh Hartnett kind of cheekily sneaks in an Eight and a Half reference when he's figuring out Diane Krieger's shoe size. Anyways, I don't want to splurge too much, of course, on Fellini here, but to get to the point, in 1968, Fellini partook in a horror anthology called Spirits of the Dead that I found interesting. Spirits of the Dead was based off a series of Edgar Allan Poe stories. An alternate title for Spirits of the Dead was, in fact, Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which coincidentally is the name of an Alan Parsons Project album that I had just listened to recently. Man, am I seeing all these coincidences popping up all over the place. However, I have never seen Spirits of the Dead. I've seen a lot of Fellini's work. Like I've seen Satyricon. I did recently see Juliet of the Spirits. That one was really good, and that actually featured Fellini's wife in there, I believe. And then I also saw City of Women. Some of these films, by the way, featured Marcello Mastroianni as a regular in his filmography. But Spirits of the Dead, although I haven't seen it yet, it is one that I have to get around to watching now that I'm actually talking about Terrence Stamp here. Because the third entry in that series, titled Toby Dammit, was directed by Fellini. The other two were not directed by him. And so the reason I bring up Toby Dammit is because Stamp's titular character is basically a perfect harbinger of the type of roles that he would take on later in his career that would push him to superstardom. That really dark, menacing, cold-eyed look. In fact, let me just, without going off on any tangents here, in Toby Dammit, Stamp plays a washed-up actor who is battling alcoholism, who decides to pursue one last acting gig. And along the way, he encounters what becomes essentially the devil. But the devil takes on the guise of a young blonde girl with a white ball. Very, very tongue-in-cheek Fellini style right there. Just like in 8.5, the really large woman in the film, Sangriana, or Sangrietta, who was this woman that had taken Marcello's virginity away as a kid, and was perceived through the Jungian lens as his anima, or I think it was his shadow, like the side that, he was trying to confront as an initiation into the mysteries of his sexuality. So that's very, very much what's going on here. Not that I'm saying that this is the same thing as 8.5, but I'm saying that like the same tongue-in-cheek surrealist approach to Fellini's style. That is such a signature of Fellini's style is going on here too, with this young blonde girl and a white ball as the personification of the devil. Now, the book that I own that I was referencing, titled Fellini, the 60s, Vincent Candy, in a September 4th, 1969 review, describes the character Toby, and I quote, as a blanched version of Poe himself, which actually does make sense, since I always saw Terence being that way as a modern day version of Poe. He hardly smiles, always has this cold, world-weary, blue-eyed stare, yet you always sense that he is kind of hiding a rather quiet, dark, sarcastic humor underneath that menacing countenance. Maybe slightly nervous, while also trying to be funny as well at the same time. And he was well suited to play under Fellini's direction, because he too always had that boyish, playful spontaneity in which he can take dark material and inject it with sarcasm, even twisted dark humor. But it's always original, and that's the reason why I love Fellini's work so much. But back to Last Night in Soho. And now I have to rewind back quite a bit here, because a little while back I was talking about the scene where Sandy is being shoved to the back as a go-go dancer. Jack starts to reveal that he's bought her out and sells her out for sex for his many different male clients that come to the club. And Sandy is also given hallucinogens to help her cope with the stress, which causes her to spiral out of control as she starts disassociating, losing her identity. One really, really tragic scene is when she's in the dressing room. She's looking at herself in the mirror, and she completely denigrates the very image that's looking back at her in the mirror, and she smashes her fist against the mirror. It cracks, and she starts bleeding, and lets out this mild scream that indicates somebody who's really, really collapsing psychologically on the inside. Very, very much like Natalie Portman, Black Swan, inner psychic collapse. She doesn't know who she is anymore, as every male client asks her for her name, and she goes back and forth by answering that she's Sandy, going from Sandy to Alexandra to Alex. Supposedly, Alexandra is her real name, but then we're not really given any background details about her upbringing, her family, her home life, though that too will start to unravel a little bit later on, and I will get to that. And try as she might, she can't escape Jack. She feels stuck and under his control psychologically. So Ellie is upset about this, and he tries to help her, and you see this happen in this really, really incredible back and forth sygyny of sorts. In other words, like, her persona starts to become really, really fluid, and she goes back and forth between, it's this one person, this one singular personality split into two different people. So, going back to the scene with the dressing room that I was talking about, when Jack comes to knock on the door to see how she's doing, when she opens up the door, it's Ellie that you see, not Sandy. So basically, there's an empathy that's going on between Ellie and Sandy, where Ellie is really, literally taking on the emotions of this poor, tortured has-been of a nightclub singer who is now just being reduced to being a sex slave for the man who is supposed to have been her manager, that was going to help her to ascend to great heights of fame and public success. And then pretty soon, Sandy's dreams start permeating into Ellie's life, into her everyday real life. She is haunted by the phantoms of the same men who have, had sex with Sandy. And another example of, this fluidity and this empathetic fluidity of personality is when Jack, grabs Sandy by the arm, and, after Sandy tries walking away from these grubby old men that want to take advantage of her, and Sandy transforms to Ellie, who then tells Jack, "Leave me alone," which, you would think is supposed to be Sandy saying that, but it's actually Ellie trying to channel what she wants Sandy to say. In fact, the most dramatic scene in the film, oh my goodness, is when we see one particular man, who, by the way, I will give away later on who this man is, but all I'm going to say is that, like the dozen or so men that were asking for Sandy's name, this one particular man is asking for, her real name. And, Sandy at this point is just like so exhausted, so drunk, so jaded. She just answers back, Sandy. And then this guy, insists that she's lying and asks, "What's your real name?" And when she says that her real name is Alexandria, he feels ready to settle on the fact that that's her real name, and then starts proceeding to tell her, You should get out of here while you still can. And at that point, you see Ellie's reflection in the mirror where Sandy is supposed to be. And Ellie starts banging her fist against the mirror, trying to get Sandy to notice her. And as the mirror shatters, she grabs hold and starts holding Sandy as if trying to save her from plunging into this great psychic abyss. So, yeah, these dreams, as dream and reality start to blur the boundaries, things start happening in Ellie's life, just as Sandy is getting somewhat of a subconscious sense of what's happening with Ellie trying to break through. In Ellie's life, she actually becomes conscious of the visions from Sandy's past permeating into her life. And yet, despite that, Edgar Wright definitely approaches these hauntings in a pretty lighthearted manner. So this isn't like watching an Ari Aster movie, for example. The scene where Ellie starts hallucinating a bloody Sandy emerging from the mannequin model and saying, "You know where to find me," which is a line that's echoed throughout the movie. She starts running from her classroom, and this is where we start getting back into what I was talking about at the beginning of this review about Edgar Wright's use of deep diving into songs from the past. And this particular song that comes on next is in fact a song that I remember from my own childhood. It's a song by the Naked Eyes called "There's Always Something There to Remind Me." But here's the twist. The Naked Eyes is not performing this song. This is actually the original version of this song. Something There to Remind Me was in fact written originally by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, while also being sung by Sandy Shaw. She was the original singer of that song, who, and as a matter of fact, this song would be covered multiple times over the years, not just by the Naked Eyes, but there would also be a cover of it by Dionne Warwick as well. So that's the genius of Edgar Wright, is that he can really, really dig deep to trace the historical origins of a song. He does that, as a matter of fact, with Got My Mind Set on You, which I always remembered as a kid as the George Harrison song. I mean, this is like a real serious mind warp here, because I feel as if an invisible wall, or like the fourth wall, had broken down from a distant part in my past where I had originally remembered a particular song being sung by an artist that I knew very, very well, only to realize now that that song that I always loved, in this case Got My Mind Set on You by George Harrison, was not the original song. It was a cover song by James Ray, also from the 60s. So it's like both famous 80s songs which had their origins in the 60s. How interesting. And how would I have known that these were covers when it was like these songs were the soundtrack to the decade I was born in? And that's what I mean by Edgar Wright's lighthearted approach to his films, in particular this film, because it's supposed to be more of a psychological horror flick. Those songs in particular add a sort of demented black humor to the scenes that both praise and poke fun at the 60s atmosphere being portrayed as this rogue ghost injected into modern times. So now I should really talk about another character that I haven't gotten too much into yet, and that's the character of John, who is this black kid who ends up becoming a strong source of emotional support for Ellie, and is clearly the nicest person who becomes a sort of a quiet, calming place in the midst of London's bustling, hedonistic, and also very scary atmosphere. And he too appears pretty early in the film. It's like, all these characters that I'm mentioning who show up at the beginning of the film who just kind of appear to be in the background and then slowly start seeping into the foreground more and more. Like early on in the film, when John and Ellie first meet, Ellie is rather protective of herself. When John spots her struggling to pull the suitcase up the stairs while on the dolly, he offers to help, but Eloise kindly responds, "No, I've got it. It's all good." And then, of course, the late night party scene where she's sitting alone with her Beats headphones on while everyone is walking around glancing at her, intruding on her space. Again, John comes along, asks if this was her Coca-Cola with her name on it, realizing what a dumbass he was to actually drink that without even asking. But then Eloise kindly just tells him very firmly, you can have it. Now, later on, it turns out that John is someone that Ellie needs in her life as she decides, finally, at one crucial point towards the final third of the film, that she wants to go out with him. And so he decides to invite her out to go dancing with him one night just to get away from the ghosts in her apartment. Like, she's afraid at this point to even fall asleep. So she just wants to go out and have fun instead. I mean, initially she really liked being alone, choosing to remain disconnected from social life. But now there's, so many terrifying, scary things have happened at this point that there's clearly an unspecified mental illness now that's really coming through that's making her feel vulnerable. I really found myself feeling for her, feeling her for her fear and her alienation, just feeling like a social outcast trying to fit in. So, there's like the past trauma that she's experienced from her mom passing away through suicide. So now at this point, when Ellie decides to go out and to explore more of her extroverted side, she goes to this club and she starts breaking out from just being really, really, like, really, really restrained. She decides to drink a little bit of alcohol here, and this song Happy House by Suey and the Banshees comes on, and she's all dressed up, with like black eyeliner and black gothic clothing, and her hair is like really, really, you know, messy looking to just give her the look of somebody to just wants to fit in with this Halloween party that she's going to. And just when she thinks that she's able to let loose and have fun for a change, it happens again. The same ghosts of those men and Jack chasing Jack chasing Sandy down the alleyway. And this time now, basically showing himself to be essentially like an extension of the guy who was being a pervert to Sandy early on in the film, the guy that Jack had to punch his lights out to because he was the guy that called Sandy a slut. And now Jack is the one who is calling Sandy a slut just for walking out on him. So you can see the irony there, and just the paradoxical nature of Jack, as well as what you've seen of Ellie and Sandy, up to this point. And then there's the scene where Ellie is running outside the club in the rain, and John comes to comfort her and offer her just a shoulder to cry on, and she decides that she doesn't want to go home alone, so she decides to invite John over to the apartment, and that's when they start kissing and making out really passionately. And the two are at Ellie's apartment, and they're about to have sex. They're just making out at this point on the bed. And there's this mysterious mirror that's on the ceiling that kind of gives me Basic Instinct vibes. Although, this movie is way, way better than that terrible Paul Verhoeven film. But she looks up at the mirror and once again has another vision. And it's this vision that becomes the serious breaking point for Eloise's psychosis. She sees Sandy and Jack on the bed, what supposedly looks like a rape scene. And, Eloise is screaming, telling Jack to get off of her. And John is, wondering who she's talking to, who, she's telling, to get off, who to get off of who. And poor John, of course, feels confused and scared, not knowing, what he can do to help her. So the tension starts to get more and more intense until finally it all culminates with with Sandy getting repeatedly stabbed to death by Jack. And it's also at this point as well that Diana Rigg, the landlord, opens up the door. At this point she heard a whole bunch of racket, obviously coming from upstairs, so she had to see what was going on. And the instant that she sees John, you know, John at this point, you know, had been trying to leave, and he ends up smashing the mirror close to Ellie's bed before finally running out the door, you know, even just neglecting his shoes too. But then once the landlady switches on the light, she's asking Eloise if John did anything to harm her, and she says no. Well, because what she was really scared of was actually a vision of a murder that had taken place over 40 years ago. Well, and what's tragic is that she's the only one who can see it. So this is the point where she finally decides to go on a police investigation to Scotland Yard to look into this matter. You know, even visiting her library to read up on missing or dead persons. And, you know, once again, John is there backing her up 100% as well. He's the only one, besides Eloise's grandmother, who cares about her and wants her to be safe. And unfortunately, when she starts talking to the police about this, they too are added to the list of people who think that she's crazy. Yeah. And once again, just like with Jocasta and the roommate situation, I was also a bit pissed off about that. And I think that they went too far, considering that they are cops and they're supposed to, you know, protect people who are in serious danger, you know, laughing behind her back because she doesn't have any physical evidence. She only has her intuition to go off of. Although the female cop sticks around and kindly asks, you know, if her family ever had a history of mental illness, possibly schizophrenia. So it's like the poor girl is struggling to find a support system to help her out. And you know, regardless of even the police having a hard time trying to help her, word does eventually get back around to her landlady. And, you know, that's when we actually start finding out the hidden history behind Alexandria. That's when we start finding out about Diana Rigg and the fact that much later on, when Ellie starts seeing Alexandria's name on her mail, she, you know, starts putting two and two together and realizes that you know, her and Sandy are one and the same person. In order to really talk about Alexandria, the landlady, though, we have to jump back to Lindsay for a moment now, so that we can actually start seeing how both him and her are essentially the underlying halves of this puzzle that both of their psychological undergrounds have remained invisible within the fabric of this film the whole time, ever since they were introduced. Okay, so when Ellie confronts Lindsay at the bar, so at this point Ellie shows up for work late, goes down into the basement to start her job for the night, being a bartender, and Lindsay happens to be there, sitting, enjoying a beer, and the song Eloise by Barry Ryan is playing on the jukebox. This was actually the song which, side note, Freddie Mercury from Queen um, was so inspired by this song to actually write Bohemian Rhapsody with, because of the length in which Eloise went. I mean, the length of the song is 5.5, 6 minutes, and it became a number one hit single. So yeah, for all those uptight, Queen freaks out there who worship, the ground with Freddie Mercury, keep in mind that there's nothing entirely pure about that Bohemian Rhapsody song being, such an overplayed hit on the radio. It definitely, got its inspiration from a more obscure source musically. Anyways, enough with my bragging though. Um, the song, the song Eloise by Barry Ryan is playing while Lindsay is in the bar, and it seems like he's having to stand up for himself as much as Ellie is standing up for Sandy. Because what goes on is Ellie tries to confront him by, just first acting professional, treating him, like he's just a regular customer at the bar. Um, like they go back and forth talking about how, he's a ladies' man and happens to know, about the identities of the women around there, and how it happens that a lot of these women tend to go missing, and he never really ends up seeing their name on a gravestone. I remember that was one of the lines that Lindsay was saying. And, so a line like that, is a clue that Eloise exploits to back up her observation that Lindsay may be an alias for Jack. Lindsay, however, starts surmising that Ellie's accusations against him are in fact orchestrated by Alexandra from a distance to get back at him for finding her out. Because at one point, at one point, Ellie, takes Lindsay's beer, throws it down on the ground, and accuses him by saying, "I know you did it. I know you killed her." And he's just like, "I've had enough with this line of inquiry." And it's just like, I know you killed her. Do I give a flying fuck? And then it really, really starts to reach a fever pitch point where Lindsay says, "Wherever Alexandra is, whatever hell Alexandria has dug herself in, tell her I said hello," or, something along those lines. In which at that instant, a car crashes right into him, just, all of a sudden, boom, and Lindsay is rolling around on the ground, bleeding from his head, and it's at that point that it becomes clear that Lindsay is actually a cop. That Lindsay is not at all what Eloise thinks he is. And, again, the mysterious young cop that I had talked about that was telling Sandy, to get out of there as soon as she can, that was obviously him. So he wanted to help Sandy, who at the time was so deeply under Jack's control and unable to escape. Even when she does escape, she disappears without a trace. And he had just assumed that she had hid from the world and was spying on him the whole time to try to make him, feel bad for what happened to her. And this definitely shakes up Ellie's world at that point, which is why she takes action and decides to leave London immediately. So she phones up John and asks her to take her back to the apartment to grab her things and then to head back to her grandmother's house out in Cornwall. But by now, it becomes obvious that something is up when Ellie wants to leave the apartment building, and she asks Alexandra for her security deposit back. And that's where the big reveal comes out, that Alex is Sandy, and that she's been hiding there the whole time as a landlady. Her real name is listed on the mail that she receives, Alexandra Collins. So as Ellie is begging Alexandra to let her leave in the middle of the night, Alex diverts the conversation in a different direction. She also drugs Ellie's tea as well. She brings up with Ellie that the police had come over to visit and that the story of the supposed death of Sandy was that she wasn't killed by Jack. Rather, she killed Jack and all the other men who forced sex upon her. And keep in mind, too, that the men who were lured to Sandy's apartment to have sex with her were declared to be missing persons, and hence explains why Lindsay earlier, before getting killed himself by the runaway car, thought that Ellie was sent as a messenger to torture him. Basically, Sandy/Alexandra's soul was destroyed, and so were the men that Jack was pimping her out with. As Alexandra reveals, I don't think they knew who they were. In other words, the men themselves were just as disassociated from their true selves and were obviously so miserable with their lives, probably in unhappy marriages, that they could only find some sort of release through Sandy, who was like this perfect flower child girl that they could deflower. So it's like it was a lose-lose situation on both ends. That pretty much sums up how romance can turn toxic when you pursue a dream and feel so swept away by the free, loving, hippie spirit of the 60s, only to then have it crushed once you make yourself vulnerable to people you trust so blindly and naively. That, of course, is the hidden demon of the 1960s that no one wants to talk about, that only Edgar Wright had the guts to do. Disassociation, is real. And this film really goes to show what happens when you lose your identity and drift further away into this daydream world, where it's like you want everything to be a vacation every single day, and your sense of self to a dream that is really just being sold to you for profit, which ultimately makes you the bait. It seems like, the 60s was like this beautiful psychedelic landscape, but there is definitely a dark void, a vortex that people like Sandy were being sucked down, And, Beyond the Black Rainbow by Panos Cosmatos is a similar movie that explores, the dark side of the New Age movement at that time in the 60s. I'm really going to need to review that film at some point. So, it's really all about romance versus power. You can't really have one without the other. If you choose to see things through rose-colored glasses, you neglect the fact that you need a thick skin to endure and fight back against potentially malevolent forces that want to sabotage your dream. This is what you wanted, as Jack, says to taunt Sandy during that point where Sandy, it just feels really, really vulnerable, really tortured, and really lost. And so the sad story about Alexandra slash Sandy is that she could not do that. Kind of like how Natalie Portman was unable to experience that transcendence that she wanted in Black Swan without killing herself by accident because she couldn't handle the power and responsibility that comes with pursuing an ideal to land the perfect role as a ballet dancer. And so at this point, this is where Alexandria ends up attempting to kill Ellie and John in the process, and ends up accidentally knocking the cigarette tray into the box of records, which then starts up this great roaring fire that ultimately starts engulfing the entire flat building. And Alexandra ends up, coming to her senses at a very, very critical point when Ellie is trying to escape upstairs into her bedroom, and all the ghosts of the men that were murdered start breaking through the walls, similarly to what Ellie did earlier on when breaking through the mirror to try to grab Sandy while she was being interrogated by Lindsay, by young Lindsay. What happens is one of the men ends up actually picking up the landline phone as basically a soundboard to project outwards, the voice that had been silenced for so long. And it's simply two words that he says very hoarsely to Sandy: "Kill her," which is then echoed in all the other male ghosts that tell her, that she needs to kill Sandy. But Ellie is hesitant to do so, especially at the moment when Alexandra finally comes to her senses. And, when Jack comes up to her and says, "You wanted this for yourself." I still remember getting really teary-eyed when old Alexandra looks at young Alexandra in the mirror and young Alexandra says back to her, I didn't. And it's just this echo that I swear just pierced my heart. It was like a moment where I just wanted to break down and cry because I felt so sorry for her, even as demented and as hardened as she had become in her old age. I felt sorry for her, as did Ellie. And Ellie, of course, would feel even more heartbroken a few seconds later when Alexandra ends up being the one who tries to kill herself by cutting her own throat. Ellie makes an attempt to stop her, throws the knife away, but by then it's too late. She decides she wants to stay inside the apartment and burn along with the apartment. So she ends up getting engulfed by the flames, finally, putting her tortured soul at rest. Ellie and John manage to make it out of the burning apartment building as the fire department comes along. And yeah, I mean, everything goes black. Darkness happens then after that. And then what follows just a few seconds after is a mysterious Sandy look-alike silhouette emerges down the runway as a mirror of the opening image in the film where Ellie is opening the doorway of the hall of her childhood home. A similar setup is going on here. where now we've basically fast forwarded 1 year later to where Ellie now is putting on her first fashion show. So now, basically, um, after everything that she's gone through, she's experienced a catharsis, a release of, after Alexandra, after she found out her true identity and tried to save her, the fact that, she's now resting in peace has helped to allow Ellie to move on and have a normal and fruitful life after this. Her and John are officially now in a relationship. Her grandmother comes to see the show. Jocasta actually starts having respect for her. And it's all a happy ever after for Ellie. I mean, she's finally living out her potential. And, um, Sandy was the inspiration for that. Which still brings one lingering question, though, about the movie after everything that I have just talked about for over the last hour or so is, was Sandy Ellie's late mother? Or how was she connected to Ellie's late mother? Because, the last scene in the film is when her gran says to Ellie, "Your mom would be so happy for you." And Ellie responds, "I know," and kind of a wink wink sort of manner as she turns around, looks at the mirror. She sees her mom in the mirror, and then that's followed by Sandy again. So this was the part that I got a little bit confused about. Because, I mean, who knows what happened in that last year after she escaped from the fire, after she escaped from Alexandra killing herself. Did she go to therapy? Did she use her empaths? Did her empath skills, lead to her being a success because she could then find the right models who fit her vision of recreating 60s fashion for a modern 2021 look? Who knows? Who knows what went on exactly? It's hard to say. All I know is that, everyone close to her knew that she was gifted and would support her. And really, in the end, it was all about, just caring for Ellie, who is really, at the center of this whole movie the whole time. The poor girl was traumatized by the events of someone else's life. She took on another person's experiences, another person's feelings, and, the impressions from those times. But she was able to transform all that and find Sandy to be a muse for her clothing designs, which is indicated by that final shot where she sees Sandy / Alexander's reflection in the mirror, as well as her mom, and they both wink and touch the mirror before the credits roll. So, yeah. And that is my review. That is all of Last Night in Soho that I just reviewed. So, in conclusion, I absolutely loved this movie. I was drawn to the psychedelic look of the visuals and the use of the neon color. And I liked how dark it was, but also very, very pretty to look at. That's usually what I like in my scary movies, too. Just like Panos Cosmatos movies, for example, which are very, very eye-filling, in which like every frame feels like it should be a painting that I could frame up on my wall. And the nostalgia of hearing those songs from the 1960s again when I was a child was definitely icing on the cake. All were genuine reasons for me to buy this movie just as soon as it came out on DVD. It literally, after the movie left the theaters, I waited until it was available to buy on Amazon because I had to have a copy of this movie. This was definitely one of the rare times where I put an advanced order on it too, so that it would be mailed to my house as soon as it reached its release date. And the bonus features were definitely rewarding as well, for sure. So, I can't recommend this film enough. Please see it, whatever you do. Please see this movie. And yeah, that is all. So I hope you enjoyed my review, and I will see you next time on the Integrating Real Perspective. Cheers.